Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Good morning, and here is our last lesson from the book of Judges. And it's going to deal with a tribe that we haven't heard much about yet. And it's the tribe of Dan. And if you are a Bible student and you look on your maps to find out where Dan was, you might be surprised to find it in two places on the same map. One in the area around Gaza, and one way up north in Israel, right on the border with Syria. And it's not that the map maker made a mistake, but we're going to find out that Dan starts out in the southwest part of Palestine, where the Gaza Strip is now, and eventually the tribe of Dan was forced to move way north, and they kept going until they found some territory that they felt like they could hold. And so there is the city of Dan in the north, which has been excavated by my alma mater, Lee.
Very good.
And it's a very interesting dig that continues there from time to time.
Well,
that's the reason why Dan is on the map in two places.
Yeah. And we're going to see the background of the necessity of their move.
Exactly.
Our last judge in the book of Judges is Samson.
Not the last judge in the book, but the last one we're looking at.
Okay. And we're going to see the pressure on the tribe of Dan. And this was also felt by the people of Judah as well.
Yes.
That came from the people of the Philistines. So we've met the Canaanites, and we've met the
Midianites,
the
Ammonites.
And now we're to the Philistines. They were just surrounded by fairly warlike peoples, jealous for the land that the Israelites had taken over during the time of Joshua.
Well, should we talk a few minutes about the Philistines?
I think we need to. We need to chat about the Philistines because they were a dominant force in Palestine at that time.
And their effect will be still there, even in the time of Hezekiah, centuries later. Mm-hmm. And that territory was always a bit of a problem for the kings of Judah. And it still remains a problem for Israel today.
Yeah, our viewers will know exactly where we are because it's much in history, in current events, the Gaza Strip.
Yes.
And this is an area where Palestinians now live, and there's a lot of conflict and a lot of tension between the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the Israelis who live in the southern part of the country there. So there's always been tension that goes way back to Philistine times.
It does. And well, these Philistines apparently are a part of a mass movement of people who were referred to back by their contemporaries as being sea people.
Right.
That's S-E-A.
Yeah.
That means people who came from the sea.
Uh-huh. Unlike these other tribal opponents of Israel, they weren't relatives of the Israelites.
No.
The Ammonites were distant relatives in a way.
Yeah.
And so were the Midianites.
And in terms of linguistics, the languages that they spoke, the Ammonites, Edomites, and even the Phoenicians, it was one language, which in the Old Testament is called the language of Canaan.
Yeah. But that's not true of the Philistines.
No.
They bring a different language, a different culture, different ethnicity, and they come from out in the central Mediterranean.
Actually, they seem to have some connections with the very early Greeks. and we refer to them as Mycenaeans, and coming from Greece and from the Aegean area.
Right. So these are people who lived on the islands of the Aegean Sea, probably, or
and even Cyprus.
Cyprus, southern part of the peninsula of Greece, maybe a little bit in Turkey.
Yes.
And this is the Mycenaean culture that was so prominent in the development of the Greek culture.
And there is no question about their pottery. Their pottery is so distinctive, coming from another world, you might say. It's very easy to spot.
Yeah. We're talking about the era of the Trojan War, for instance. That's something that people can make a connection to. So these people, for what reason we don't know, began a mass migration over to the east. And this group that we call the Philistines landed on this southwest shore.
Yeah. Now, other parts of this mass movement wound up on the coast of what is now Lebanon, and also in the coast of Sinai, and even on the edge of Egypt.
Okay.
And the Egyptians had a lot of problems dealing with them. Eventually, they settled down, and the Egyptians even used some of them as border guards in historic times. So
now, one of the distinctive things about the Philistines is that they built 5 major cities along the coast there that became centers of culture, centers of manufacturing, as well as politics.
Gaza is the one that we know best, but there's Ashkelon, Ashdod, Eglon, and Gath.
Yeah. And even today, some of those exist. Ashkelon, for instance, is a resort city.
And Ashdod, too,
area.
I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it'd be beautiful climate and beautiful resorts. But there was nothing beautiful about the Philistines to the Israelite people. What else did they have that made them so powerful? And
well, they had a new type of chariotry. And that they introduced two-wheel chariotry, I think, to the Middle East. But beyond that, they also had the ability to work iron, and that gave them a vast advantage. And it's even interesting that Goliath's spear point was said to have been of iron. And then we have read about Sisera and his chariotry with iron
embossing and things.
Well, probably holding the chariots together or something or another.
Yeah.
At any rate, they came along, and we don't know precisely when they first set foot on this land, but somewhere about the same time that the Israelites were coming in from the eastern direction. So it's almost like they clashed right there in that area where they settled, where the Philistines settled.
Right.
And they were constantly then at war, and there was no question of who was stronger.
Yeah. The Philistines had an advantage in every way. They were culturally way more sophisticated than in terms of music and literature and art and things like that.
And political organization.
They were much better organized, and they had this military and agricultural advantage of the smelting of iron, because that would have increased their agricultural productivity as well.
I once heard my teacher say that this ability to work iron depended on previous inventions. And made the point that you can't smelt iron until you can get it hot enough to work. And that required then a technology of coal, not coal, but creating what we burn, charcoal, for example.
Yeah. To make a fire hotter than a wood fire.
Than just a wood fire,
Yeah.
Wood fire is not. You can work copper and bronze and brass even a little bit with a wood fire by throwing a lot of oxygen on it, but not iron. And iron required more concentrated carbon.
Yeah.
For it to. That technology had to come first.
Good. Well, that's what the people of Dan are up against. They live just north of the Philistine territory. That's what the people of Judah are up against. They're just east, and that's what Samson is up against. So why don't we get started in Samson's story here?
Okay, and we're going to start with the beginning this time. We don't have to fill in the missing verses in front of our scripture. It's right here. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. A certain man of Zorah named Manoah, from the clan of the Danites, had a wife who was childless, unable to give birth. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, "You are barren and childless, but you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son. Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean. You will become pregnant and have a son whose head is never to be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be a Nazarite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hand of the Philistines." Then the woman went to her husband and told him, "A man of God came to me. He looked like an angel of God, very awesome. I didn't ask him where he came from, and he didn't tell me his name. But he said to me, 'You will become pregnant and have a son. Now then, drink no wine or other fermented drink, and do not eat anything unclean, because the boy will be a Nazarite of God from the womb until the day of his death.'" Now we skip down to verse 24. "The woman gave birth to a boy and named him Samson. He grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he was in Machanedan, between Zorah and Eshtaol." Machanedan, Dan, is the encampment of Dan. It's a location where there were a lot of Danites living together.
Well, that is just the very tip of the iceberg, isn't it? When it comes to the story of Samson, there is so much more.
It gets so very complicated. We know we can't get through the whole story this morning. But we want to focus on the important elements that relate to the person who is very powerful, and the way in which he interacts with his own people, with the foreign people, and with God.
Okay. Well, we've had the story of Jephthah most recently, and in between Jephthah and Samson were three judges. We just barely know their names. We don't know much about them. This becomes the next main judge in our story, and we see right from the start this cycle repeating itself. Verse 1, the Israelites did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord, and so the Lord allowed an enemy, a fierce enemy, to harass them and to oppress them, and that in this case is the Philistines.
Right.
And this has gone on for 40 years now, so they're really getting frustrated, the people of Judah and of Dan.
Now it's very interesting that we have had three judges before who were able to organize militia or force, a force of some size against Israel's enemies. And we are going to depart from that pattern. We have a one-man army here, and he seems not to have been able to gather a fighting force or to have enlisted anyone else.
Well, he doesn't.
In his effort,
he doesn't seem to be able to work well with anybody. Children sometimes, don't play well with other kids. Well, Samson does not play well with
we don't hear about his youth, but I imagine that he was a terror on the playground.
He doesn't seem very responsive to the guidance of his parents, for one thing.
No.
And we see him hanging out with the enemy Philistines about as often or more often, as he hangs out with his own people, we don't see much relationship there.
Well, where Manoah and his wife, his family, and Samson were living was right on the border, as best we can tell. And so it's like Samson could look across a little space there, and he is looking at this superior culture with, the grass is greener on the other side kind of mentality must have moved him, because he demands from his parents that they will take a Philistine girl for him for a wife.
Yeah.
And why, would he do that? Well, because they're different. They are more exciting, or there's something exciting about them. Some people, are just drawn for a mate to that which is just opposite from what you have grown up with.
Yeah.
And that's Samson. I mean, he loves everything Philistine, especially the women.
But then he also becomes vengeful and hateful toward them as it goes. Well, that is what you can expect. He wants to prove that he is as good as any Philistine, in fact, better than them. Yeah.
That comes out in the story very clearly.
Well, that business of marrying a Philistine woman against his parents' will is kind of the beginning of his downward trend. His life actually starts out filled with promise, because he has two loving parents who want a child very, very much. And we get yet another one of these stories of a married couple who can't have children and who long for children and are provided a child by God.
It does seem like he's a spoiled brat.
It could well be. But we've seen this pattern in the story of Abraham and Sarah, for instance. They couldn't have children. And for a while, Isaac and Rebekah. We're going to see it a little later in history with the parents of Samuel.
It's very similar.
Very
story.
similar to the Samuel the birth part of the story is very similar, and then we're going to see it again, even up into the New Testament.
Well, Zechariah and Elizabeth and John the Baptist.
That's true.
So he was a latecomer. John was a latecomer in that family.
Yeah. So the messenger of the Lord, the angel of the Lord, comes and speaks to the barrenness of this couple and their desire to have a child, and promises that a son will be born. But we learn that right from the start that this son will be a Nazarite.
Now, that being the case, then there are certain requirements upon the mother. And that's stated in the scripture twice.
Yeah, you're going to become pregnant. See to it that you drink no wine. That's addressed to the mother.
Or alcoholic
or any
beverage.
alcoholic beverage, yeah.
Not only that, but you must not have anything to do with anything from the vine.
And
you can't eat grapes or raisins.
And then adds to it, don't eat anything unclean. So a reminder of those food laws in Leviticus 11.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now the term Nazarite refers to what? Let's clarify.
It means something like guarded. Someone who is in a special situation, who has to live under certain constraints.
Okay. It's sometimes translated or explained as someone dedicated to the Lord, consecrated to the Lord. So this son...
And by the way, some connection between that and the name of the town where Jesus lived.
Nazareth, yeah. So he's to be a Nazarite, dedicated to God, and according to Numbers chapter 6, there were several expectations attached to Nazarites.
Now that whole chapter is devoted to the issue of the Nazarite vow, and how does it work, and what if it's broken, and how do you conclude it, and all kinds of things like that. And the last thing in that chapter is the priestly blessing. May the Lord...
right, the Aaronic blessing.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So now there are 3 requirements for the Nazarite. He must not go where a dead body has been, must not touch a dead body, even his mother, brother, or father, or whatever. He may not have any product of the vine, and especially wine or any alcoholic beverage. And lastly, he must not cut his hair. Now, later in Jewish practice, there were all kinds of other restrictions relative to it. But there are some restrictions explained in chapter 6, and also how do you bring a Nazarite vow to an end.
Oh, yeah. So Nazarites could be men or women.
Yes.
And it could be a lifelong vow or a temporary vow, right?
Later in Judaism, the Judaism of Jesus' day, they had 3 levels of Nazarite vows. There is just the Nazarite vow. There is the perpetual Nazarite vow, and there's a vow that's named in honor of Samson. The Samson Nazarite vow, which was the most strenuous. Now, the Nazarite vow could be undertaken for a minimum of 30 days, or it could be for life. And if there are all kinds of rules about it. In fact, there is a tractate in the Mishnah on this very subject. So it's spelled out, what the rules are spelled out in that volume of rules of the oral law.
So Samson really gets off to a good start. He's born into a family of parents who have longed for him and surely loved him. And they
seem a little indulgent.
They do. But they've dedicated him to the service of God, and at God's request, he's made a Nazarite. Unfortunately, Samson doesn't live up to the godliness of his parents, and he doesn't live up to the expectations of his Nazarite status, either one.
Well, they're hidden in the stories of Samson. It becomes clear that he violates 2 of the 3 basic rules of being a Nazarite.
So
he touches dead bodies all over the place. In fact, he kills them.
He makes them. He makes them.
And then he throws lavish parties. And what you don't see in English is that the term for these parties in Hebrew is mishteh, which means a drinking party.
Oh, okay.
So, they had something to eat, but they also were drinking.
So this early Nazarite turns out to be one of the worst Nazarites in history.
Yes.
The only thing he managed to do was keep his hair long, and
locks, of hair. He was not allowed to cut his hair. And in fact, in some rules of modern day Nazarites, you're not even allowed to comb your hair.
Yeah.
Because you might pull one of the hairs out as you're combing it.
Wow.
Pharisaical rule.
Well, it's interesting. When you read the story of Samson, his hanging out with prostitutes and his vengeful violence, you just wonder, why is this guy even called a judge? How could he be doing anything godly?
Man of faith in Hebrews 11?
Yeah. And so there are a few hints. He is dedicated to God at the beginning of his life. And clearly by the end of his life, he has not forgotten God. We're skipping way ahead in the story of Samson, but at the very end, he's been blinded, he's been betrayed by Delilah, had his hair cut, captured by the Philistines, blinded, and brought out.
And made as a joke.
Brought out into the temple where a great festival is going on, just to be paraded before them and mocked. And
he's blind for one thing.
Yeah.
And he has to be led. This man that we feared and that killed so many of us and was such a terror to us Philistines. Look at him now.
But he positions himself by two of the main supporting pillars. And his hair has grown back, his strength has returned,
and he's repented.
Yes, but he still has a strong personal vengeance, and so he pulls down the pillars, and thousands of the Philistine worshipers of their god are destroyed in that process.
But and the Bible even says that he killed more in his death than he did in his whole life.
Yeah.
And he killed a bunch.
But the words he gives before that act of final desperate vengeance, remember me, Lord God, remember me. For this one occasion, God, give me strength. So we see kind of a sad picture here of a man who was born dedicated to God and who ends his life with God on his mind. He's thinking of God and asking for God's continued blessing, but in the process lives such an ungodly life. And I thought your analysis of this that we discussed a little earlier was so helpful. The previous three judges that we have encountered here this month were all people of weakness. Barak was afraid to go into battle without Deborah.
Yes.
And Gideon says, I'm the weakest in my clan, why me? And Jephthah is a reject and an outcast, an illegitimate child, a brigand, and their weakness. But God was able to use them to accomplish great things.
In fact, that's the way God frequently acts in the Bible.
But as you pointed out, Samson is just the opposite. He is strong, he is able, he is capable, and that kind of became his downfall, didn't it?
That was his weakness.
That
was his weakness.
His strength was his weakness.
Yeah.
Instead of, like Paul saying, God's strength is perfected in my weakness, his weakness was his own strength.
His own physical strength.
His own physical strength.
But weakness, he had a weakness. And it was a weakness of commitment. Because Delilah, who was not his wife, she was just a prostitute that the Philistine lords used to figure Samson out.
Yeah.
And she wore him, she was stronger than he was. And with all of her weakness, she outlasted him. Yeah. She became more and more demanding, and finally he couldn't take it anymore, and he gave in.
Yeah.
And that was his weakness.
So that's a great lesson from this story. This strong man, strongest, one of the strongest men ever, his strength became his weakness. I guess the other lesson is that even someone whose weakness is their strength can still be used by God to accomplish deliverance for his people.
I think that's an amazing thing in the story. In fact, in spite of the fact of his failure, and at the end, he, in one tremendous act of repentance and commitment to God, God gave him the strength to bring the temple of Dagon down.
Very good.
And on this lovely ending, we end the story of our study in the book of Judges. There are other stories in the book of Judges which you may want to read. They are very informative. But next week we move to the prophets of Israel, and we'll be looking at the prophets for a while. And we trust that you will come back and be with us and join us in that study. God be with you.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.